Okay, so welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing circadian clocks. Okay, right, so in this final video, what I want to do is discuss the topic of chronopharmacology. Okay, now chronopharmacology is all about how the effect of a drug on a person is going to be different depending on the time of day that you take the drug. Okay, so that's what chronopharmacology is all about. Okay, now there are two broad different reasons why the effect of taking a drug can be different at different times of the day. Okay, and we can divide these up into two very long words. Okay, and these two very long words are chronopharmacokinetics and chronopharmacodynamics. Okay, right, so to understand what these two things mean, you need to know what pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics are. Okay, so chronopharmacodynamics. Okay, right, so let's discuss firstly what pharmacokinetics is, and therefore what chronopharmacokinetics is. Okay, so pharmacokinetics is all to do with the absorption of a drug, the distribution of the drug, the metabolism of a drug, and the absorption of a drug. Okay, so when you take a drug molecule, usually you will take it orally. Okay, the effect that that drug molecule is actually going to have is not just dependent on what the drug molecule actually binds to and things like that. Instead, it's also to do with how much of the drug molecule is actually going to be absorbed into the blood, where the circulation is actually going to distribute the drug to, how quickly the drug is going to be metabolized by the liver, and then how quickly it's going to be excreted from the body. Okay, so those four concepts can be abbreviated down to ADME, basically. Okay, so pharmacokinetics is often described as ADME. A for absorption, D for distribution, M for metabolism, and E for excretion. So the effect of a drug isn't just about once it gets to its target area, what does it actually do? So let's say it's an anti-cancer chemotherapy drug. Okay, so we want it to get to the cancer cells and then kill the cancer cells. Okay, but the effect of the anti-cancer drug isn't just about how it kills the cancer cells once it gets there. It's also going to be hugely about how much of the drug that you take is actually going to get to the cells, the cancer cells, and for how long it's actually going to be there. And that's what pharmacokinetics is about. It's about if you take a certain amount of the drug orally, how much is actually going to get absorbed, how much is actually going to get distributed to where you need it to be. Okay, how long is it going to be there? And the question of how long is it going to be there is all about how quickly is the drug metabolized by the liver, and then how quickly is it excreted by the kidneys. Okay, so pharmacokinetics is all about the delivery of the drug to the site of action, basically. Okay, and chronopharmacokinetics is all about how the pharmacokinetics, the delivery of the drug to the site of action, is affected by what time of day you take it. Okay, so the key example of chronopharmacokinetics that I'm going to give you in a moment is how aspirin will be absorbed better if you take it in the evening. Okay, right. Chronopharmacodynamics then. So firstly, what is pharmacodynamics? Pharmacodynamics is now about once the drug has got to where we want it to be, it's got to its target site, what does it then actually do? So in the case of the anti-cancer chemotherapy drug, it'll be how does it actually kill the cell? Okay? And chronopharmacodynamics is then about how does the effect of the drug once it actually gets to its target site change depending on the time of day? So maybe the anti-cancer chemotherapy drug might be more effective at killing the cancer cell at a certain time of day, and there is increasing evidence that that might be the case, that certain anti-cancer chemotherapy drugs are more effective against cancer cells at certain times of the day because the cancer cells change their behaviour on a circadian basis, and at certain times of the day they're more susceptible to certain drugs, basically. Okay, and there is a lot of interest in that at the moment. Okay, I still don't really have any hard, solid examples to give you of that yet. Okay, but there is a lot of interest in as to whether we should be looking at cancer cell circadian rhythms, and from that be deciding what time of day it would be best to give an anti-cancer drug if we want to kill cancer cells. Okay, right, but the key example that I will give you of chronopharmacodynamics is statins, and how they're much more efficacious if you take them in the evening than if you take them in the morning. Okay, and that's all to do with the fact that the target for statins is expressed at much higher levels during the evening than it is in the morning, basically. Okay, right, so as I say, the best way to illustrate these two concepts are to give examples. So let's give the chronopharmacokinetics example firstly. Okay, so we're going to talk about aspirin, which is an anti-inflammatory drug and a painkiller. Okay, a very commonly used anti-inflammatory drug and painkiller. Okay, right, so aspirin's absorption is better if you take it in the evening. Okay, so this is all about the pharmacokinetics of aspirin that we're talking about. Okay, if you take it orally, the amount that will actually be absorbed is greater in the evening, okay, than if you take it in the morning. Now, why is this? Well, we need to discuss the absorption of aspirin in a little bit more detail to understand why this actually is, okay? So, specifically, the thing that we need to understand is that aspirin is actually a weak acidic molecule, and that has great bearing for where it is absorbed when you take it orally. Okay, so let me give you then the official name for aspirin. Okay, so the more official name for aspirin is acetyl salicylic acid, or rather the more chemical name for aspirin is acetyl salicylic acid. Okay, right. Now, we know what acetyl is, so that just means we've got an acetyl group attached onto salicylic acid. But what actually is salicylic acid? So salicylic acid is the old chemist's name for a molecule that now has a new chemist's name, okay? And the new name for salicylic acid is 2-hydroxybenzoic acid. Okay, and that's a more useful name because that allows us to work out what this molecule actually is. Okay, so let me now draw out for you then the structure of aspirin, the structure of acetyl salicylic acid. Okay, right, so let's start by discussing 2-hydroxybenzoic acid, and to start with, let's discuss benzoic acid. So benzoic acid is a benzene ring, which I'll draw in skeletal formula here. Okay, so here is the benzene ring with alternating double and single bonds here. So benzene is a 6-carbon ring where you have alternating double and single bonds between the carbons in that ring, and every single one of the carbons in that ring will then have a hydrogen atom coming off it. Okay, now to turn benzene into benzoic acid, what we're going to do is off one of these carbons, we're going to take off the hydrogen, and then we're going to stick a carboxylic acid group here. Okay, so that structure now, that is benzoic acid, this portion of the name here. Okay, now, we want to turn benzoic acid then into 2-hydroxybenzoic acid, so we just need to stick an alcohol group off the second carbon of the benzoic acid molecule. Okay, so this is considered the first carbon of the benzene ring here. Okay, so then either this one or this one will be the second one, so we'll just say it's this one, it doesn't make any difference, okay, because benzene is perfectly symmetrical. Okay, so we'll put the alcohol group then off here. Okay, so this then will be 2-hydroxybenzoic acid or salicylic acid. We now want to stick an acetyl group onto this molecule to create us acetyl salicylic acid, which is aspirin. Okay, and the way that you do this is by attaching the acetyl group onto the alcohol group here. Okay, so what we're going to do then is take the hydrogen off that alcohol group, and instead we're going to attach that oxygen atom to an acetyl group, which is just the acyl group of an ethanoic acid molecule, like so. Okay, so scratch that hydrogen off there. Okay, and that molecule that we've now got there, that is the structure of aspirin, acetyl salicylic acid. Okay, right, or ASA for short. Right, okay, so what's the important things to understand about this molecule? Well, the important thing to understand here is that we have this acid group here, this carboxylic acid group. Now, what do acids do? What is the definition of an acid? An acid is a molecule that is capable of donating a proton away into free solution. Okay, and indeed, this alcohol group of this carboxylic acid group here is capable of donating that proton away into free solution. Okay, so basically, this is capable from looking like this to looking instead like this. Okay, the proton can detach from the hydrogen. Sorry, the proton can detach from the oxygen. Okay, so if I draw that alcohol group out in more detail, here we have the single bond between the oxygen and the hydrogen atom. The oxygen atom has put in an electron there. The hydrogen atom has put in an electron there to make that single covalent bond here. Okay, what can happen is the proton, which is the only other portion of the hydrogen atom here, because remember, a hydrogen atom just consists of a proton and an electron normally, and no neutrons. Okay, so what can happen is the proton can detach from here, leaving the electron behind on the oxygen, and be donated away into free solution, leaving the oxygen then with a negative charge. Okay, right, and indeed in normal sort of pHs around 7-ish, neutral sort of pH, what will happen is acetyl salicylic acid molecules, aspirin molecules, will donate their protons into free solution and therefore will have negative charges on their carboxylic acid groups. Okay, so most aspirin molecules in a neutral solution will be in this negatively charged form, and that's incredibly important. Okay, when we're considering drug absorption. Okay, because in order for the aspirin molecule to actually be absorbed from the gut into the bloodstream, it has to be able to cross lipid bilayers. Okay, now if it's a charged molecule, that's a no-no. It can't cross the lipid bilayers if it's charged. It has to be neutral to cross the lipid bilayer. Okay, so the form of aspirin where it has donated its proton away into free solution cannot actually be absorbed across the epithelial layer of the gastrointestinal tract into the bloodstream. Okay, only the neutral form can be. Okay, so what does that now mean for the absorption of aspirin? Where is it going to be absorbed? Okay, well this means that it's going to be absorbed best in the stomach. Okay, now why is it going to be absorbed best in the stomach? Because in the stomach the pH is very low. Okay, so the pH in the stomach is usually between 1.5 and 3.5. Okay, and remember there's that weird relationship between pH and proton concentration, where pH is the negative log to base 10 of the proton concentration. And that means that as pH gets smaller, the proton concentration actually gets bigger. Okay, so in the stomach then you have a very high concentration of free protons, okay, because of the hydrochloric acid in the stomach. Now what does this mean for aspirin molecules that are in the stomach? Well, it means that now they're going to end up becoming protonated, okay, because if you imagine putting this molecule in a very high proton concentration, the aspirin molecules are not going to give away their protons to a solution where there is a very high proton concentration already. Okay, they have a tendency to give their protons away if they're in a solution with a very low proton concentration. And it's simply because if they give them away in a solution where you have a very low proton concentration, the chance that they'll ever get them back again is much lower. Okay, so they tend to spend a lot of time unprotonated rather than protonated. Whereas if you have them in a very high proton concentration, the chance that this oxygen here will get another proton come along and rebind to it is much higher. Okay, so the aspirin molecules will spend a lot more of their time in the protonated neutral form than in the deprotonated negatively charged form. Okay, so at any one time you'll have a much greater fraction of aspirin molecules in the neutral protonated form than you would if you were at pH 7, for instance. Okay, and that means that most aspirin molecules are actually going to be absorbed in the stomach rather than in the small intestine. Okay, because in the small intestine the pH is much higher basically. Okay, so the pH in the intestine goes from being around 6 in the duodenum, so in the first portion of the intestine that's closest to the stomach, it's around pH 6, so this is the duodenal pH. Okay, and then once you get to the end of the small intestine, the ileum sort of portion, the pH has actually risen to 7.4. So the closer you are to the stomach, the lower the pH, which makes sense because obviously the stomach contents is emptying into the small intestine. Okay, right, but the point here is that the pH is much higher in these portions of the small intestine, basically. Okay, and that means that the fraction of the aspirin molecules that are going to be deprotonated and in the negatively charged form is going to be much higher in these places, okay, because the proton concentration is lower, and therefore the chance that they'll be reprotonated once they've given away their proton is much lower. Okay, so they'll spend a lot more time in the negatively charged form, and therefore you'll end up with a greater fraction of the molecules at any one time in the negatively charged form, in which they cannot actually cross cell membranes, so they can't be absorbed. So, what's the great message from that? Okay, aspirin is best absorbed in the stomach, and indeed this also applies for any drug that is weakly acidic. Okay, so any drug that has an acidic group in, like aspirin, is also going to be best absorbed in the stomach for this exact same reason, which is that it will be neutral in the stomach, whereas it won't be so neutral in the portions of the small intestine. Okay, right. So aspirin is best absorbed in the stomach. So what does this have to do with a 24-hour cycle? What does this have to do with chronopharmacokinetics? That's a beautiful piece of pharmacokinetics, but where is the chronopharmacokinetics? What does this have to do with aspirin being best absorbed in the evening? Well, the stomach pH is not a constant value. It shows a circadian oscillation as well. The stomach pH actually changes depending on the time of day, and stomach pH is actually lowest during the evening, i.e. the proton concentration in the stomach is at its highest during evening. Now some people use this as a piece of evidence to say that really humans should only be eating during the evening. We shouldn't be eating breakfast, okay? People who follow paleo diets sort of use this as a piece of evidence that we shouldn't be eating in the morning, we should only be eating in the evening, okay? Whether it means that or not, I shouldn't make a comment, but proton concentration does vary in the stomach on a 24-hour basis, and it is true that it is highest during the evening and actually quite low during the morning. Okay, so let's draw a graph then of this. Okay, so once again on the x-axis we will have time. So here is midnight, 4 a.m. in the morning, 8 a.m. in the morning, midday, okay, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 8 o'clock in the afternoon, and then midnight again. Okay, and basically what I will do is I'll put proton secretion on the y-axis, which I think is a more intuitive notion. Okay, so how many protons are being secreted into the stomach by the intestinal wall, basically. Okay, and you find that proton secretion is actually at its minimum at 8 o'clock in the morning, so in the morning, okay, and then it goes up through the day to get to a maximum during 8 o'clock in the evening, and then it will go back down during the night, back to its minimum during the morning here. Okay, so that is the circadian oscillation of proton secretion into the lumen of the stomach, and of course this causes an oscillation in the pH, so the pH becomes more acidic in the evening and it's least acidic during the morning, basically. Okay, so pH varies within the stomach on a circadian basis then. Okay, so what does this mean? This means that in the evening the pH of the stomach is lower than in the morning. Okay, it's more acidic. The free proton concentration is higher during the evening. Okay, that means now that if you take aspirin in the evening, now the pH is even lower in the stomach at that time, okay? So the fraction of the aspirin molecules that are going to be in the neutral protonated form, okay, is going to be even higher, so even more aspirin molecules will be absorbed. Okay, so that is why aspirin is better absorbed from the stomach in the evening, and since the stomach is the main place in which it is absorbed, then it's overall best absorbed if you take it during the evening. Okay, so that's my example of chronopharmacokinetics. Okay, now let's go on to an example of chronopharmacodynamics. Okay, so chronopharmacokinetics was all about the delivery of the drug to the site of action. Okay, and in that specific example, we looked at the absorption component of pharmacokinetics, how much drug is actually going to get from the intestine into the blood when you take it orally. Okay, pharmacodynamics, remember, is all about what the drug actually does once it gets to its site of action. What is its target? Okay, and we're now going to see an example of chronopharmacodynamics in which the expression level of the target changes on a circadian basis. And this is the example of statins. Okay, so firstly let me just tell you a bit of the background. So what statins are, what they're used to treat, okay, how they work. Okay, right, so statins, let me give you some examples of statins. There are loads of statins. They're one of the best-selling classes of drugs of all time. Okay, of all time. Some examples then. Simvastatin is an example, lovastatin is another example, atorvastatin is my final very noteworthy example of a statin, but there are loads of other ones, rosuvastatin, fluvastatin, the list goes on and on. Okay, right, but these are some notable ones. Okay, right, now they all work in the same way, okay, and they're all used to treat hypercholesterolemia. Okay, so this is what they use to treat hypercholesterolemia, which is a massive word to mean a blood cholesterol level being too high, hypercholesterolemia. Okay, so it means that the amount of cholesterol, which is a type of lipid molecule, a sterile molecule that's found within the blood, okay, is too high. Okay, so you've got too much cholesterol stored within the blood, okay, and it's not free in the blood. It's stored within structures called lipoproteins, predominantly LDL, but for our purposes, we're not going to go into that, okay? Just think of hypercholesterolemia as meaning that you've got too much cholesterol in your blood, okay? Don't worry about the details of what is actually stored within the blood. Okay, right. Basically, hypercholesterolemia is not a good thing, okay? Hypercholesterolemia leads to accelerated atherosclerosis, okay? It means that atherosclerosis progresses at a much higher rate, okay? Atherosclerosis can occur in the coronary arteries, it can occur in the cerebral arteries. It causes narrowing of the coronary arteries, it causes narrowing of the cerebral arteries. That can gradually lead to reduced blood supply to the heart and portions of the brain, okay? In addition, what can then suddenly happen is atherosclerotic plaques can burst open, they can rupture, and then on top of them, what happens is you get a thrombus forming, a blood clot formed in the middle of the blood vessel, basically, and that can completely occlude blood supply to portions of the heart and portions of the brain, and that can then lead to heart attacks and strokes, okay? So having hypercholesterolemia predisposes you to cardiovascular disease caused by atherosclerosis. It means that you're likely to get cardiovascular disease. Okay, right. So we like to treat hypercholesterolemia to prevent people getting heart attacks and strokes. Okay, now how do we treat hypercholesterolemia? Well, statins are an example of how you can treat hypercholesterolemia, and they work by stopping cells from synthesizing cholesterol. Okay, so cells all over the body, liver cells and also peripheral cells, people often forget that peripheral cells are actually capable of this too, okay, not just the liver cells. Cells all over the body, liver and peripheral cells, are capable of synthesizing cholesterol. Okay, they have a biosynthetic pathway for cholesterol, and basically statins work by inhibiting that pathway. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a brief overview of the cholesterol biosynthesis pathway. Okay, now of course we're not going to go through the full details of it. It is a massive, great biochemical pathway. Okay, I'm just going to tell you the one reaction really that we need to know in detail, okay, to understand the mechanism of statins, and then the other portions I'm just going to abbreviate down. Okay, right, so the starting point for the production then of cholesterol is that you start from acetyl coenzyme A molecules, which is obviously a very famous molecule in biochemistry, okay? It's essential in the respiration reactions. It's what glycolysis and the link reaction end up producing, so through the catabolism of glucose, you produce acetyl-CoA. It can then go through the Krebs cycle to produce reduced NAD and reduced FAD, which can then go through the electron transport chain. In addition, beta oxidation of long-chain carboxylic acids also results in the production of acetyl-CoA, which can then be fed into the Krebs cycle. So it's a central molecule to metabolic pathways. Okay, so all cells have acetyl coenzyme A, and I'll just draw a little picture for acetyl-CoA here. Okay, so it's just an acetyl group, which is the acyl group of a 2-carbon carboxylic acid, okay, like so, attached to a coenzyme A molecule. So CoA stands for coenzyme A. Okay, now we don't need to know the full structure of coenzyme A. The only important thing that you really need to know about coenzyme A is that it has a thiol group. Okay, and that this thiol group is how you can link acetyl groups onto it. Okay, so here, this is the sulfur atom of that thiol group, and it's been linked to the carboxylic acid group of the acetyl molecule via a thioester link, basically. Okay, so if you don't know much about thiol group chemistry, this is a thiol group. It is a sulfur atom with a hydrogen atom coming off it. Okay, and the way I would urge you to think about thiol groups is that they're very similar to alcohol groups. Okay, sulfur is in the same group of the periodic table as oxygen, so it has similar chemical properties to oxygen. It's actually the element just below oxygen in the periodic table. Okay, so if that was an oxygen atom in place of a sulfur atom there, of course that would just be an alcohol group. We're saying we've replaced it with this atom that has very similar chemical properties to oxygen, and therefore this thiol group is going to have very similar chemical properties to alcohol groups. Okay, and of course alcohol groups combined to carboxylic acid groups by ester links, so thiol groups can in turn bind to carboxylic acid groups by this very much so related link called a thioester link here. Okay, so this is the structure of acetyl coenzyme A here. Okay, right, so this is the starting point for the synthesis of cholesterol within cells. Okay, and what's going to happen through a bunch of steps that I'm going to abbreviate down to a single arrow is acetyl coenzyme A is going to be converted into a molecule called HMG-CoA. Okay, now what does this stand for? Well, the full name of this molecule is hideous, okay, but it's helpful. And the full name of this is beta-hydroxy, beta-methyl. So the H here is for hydroxy, then the M is for methyl, okay, and then the G is for glutarol, okay, and then it's beta-hydroxy, beta-methyl, glutarol, and then you've got coenzyme A, which I'll still just abbreviate down to CoA. So HMG-CoA is short for beta-hydroxy, beta-methyl, glutarol, coenzyme A. Okay, right. So what is the structure of this? Well, we need to start off with what is glutarol-CoA. Okay, so what is glutaric acid? Well, glutaric acid is a 5-carbon molecule where you have 2 carboxylic acid groups at either end of the 5-carbon molecule. So let me just show you this. So we're going to have 5 carbons, so I'll start by drawing the 5 carbons here. Okay, and at either end you're going to have a carboxylic acid group. Now at this end, the carboxylic acid group will be bound to a coenzyme A molecule, so that's the glutarol-CoA portion. Okay, at the other end, the carboxylic acid group will be free, and under normal physiological pH, the carboxylic acid group will have donated its proton away into a free solution. Okay, so most of the HMG-CoA molecules will have a negative charge here rather than being protonated. Okay. Right, okay, so if we just now put hydrogens in these 6 remaining sockets, so 2 hydrogens off this carbon, 2 hydrogens off this carbon, and 2 hydrogens off this carbon, that would now give us glutaryl-CoA. Okay, but we don't want glutaryl-CoA, we want beta-hydroxy, beta-methyl glutaryl-CoA, so we need to stick an alcohol group and a methyl group off this molecule at some point. So we're going to stick them off the beta carbon. Now, what is meant by the beta carbon? Well, this is old nomenclature, basically. It wouldn't be called this now if we were to use more modern nomenclature, but the old way of naming the carbons in a carboxylic acid molecule is to call the first carbon off the main carboxylic acid group, which we're taking as this one that coenzyme A is attached to, the alpha carbon. Okay, and then the second one will be called the beta carbon. So this carbon in the middle is the beta carbon. Okay, so what we're now going to have then is an alcohol group and a methyl group coming off this beta carbon in the center here, and that now gives us beta hydroxy, beta methyl glutaryl-CoA. So all I now need to do is just fill in the gaps by putting hydrogens off these 2 carbons. Okay, so that is the structure of beta hydroxy, beta methyl glutaryl-CoA. So basically you combine lots of acetyl coenzyme A molecules together to create this molecule. Okay, and it's not just one step, it's loads of steps, and we're not going to go through all of those steps. I'm just going to abbreviate those down to this arrow here, which we'll colour in orange. Right, okay, so what we now want to see is this essential reaction, and this is the one reaction that we're actually going to go through in detail, which is the conversion of beta-hydroxy, beta-methyl glutaryl-CoA, this molecule which we've now formed from acetyl coenzyme A, into a molecule called mevalonate. Okay, so I'm going to show you the product first, and then we'll talk about how the actual conversion occurs. So now, let me show you this product, which is mevalonate. Okay, so mevalonate is very similar in structure to beta-hydroxy, beta-methyl glutaryl-CoA. In fact, it's only this group right on the end here that has actually changed. The rest of this remains exactly the same, so let me just show this here. So this carboxylic acid group here is exactly the same. This methylene group that we've got here, again, that's exactly the same. The middle carbon here, the beta carbon, which has the methyl group and the alcohol group coming off, those are exactly the same. This methylene group here is exactly the same. And then now, this first carbon over here, this is completely changed. Okay, firstly, the coenzyme A has come off. Okay, so coenzyme A is going to be sat over here, bound to its proton base, well, to its hydrogen atom here. So it's back in its former glory as a free coenzyme A molecule with its phyl group reproduced. Okay, and what we're actually going to do basically is we're going to reduce this carboxylic acid group here. Okay, so if you can remember back to your basic chemical knowledge, you might remember that you can reduce carboxylic acid groups firstly to aldehyde groups and then to alcohol groups, and in fact that's what we're going to do here. So this is now going to become an alcohol group like so, with 2 hydrogens coming off here, and this is the structure of mevalonate. Okay, so we now want to study this conversion in a lot more detail, but before I just go over that reaction in more detail, I'll then put in the final step, which is that mevalonate molecules can be used to actually produce cholesterol molecules. And again, that's a nightmare number of steps. There's a huge number of steps in turning mevalonate molecules into cholesterol molecules, but we're not going to go through those steps. Okay, so the overall pathway that we are abbreviating this down to is acetyl coenzyme A can be used to produce HMG-CoA molecules. HMG-CoA molecules can be converted into mevalonate molecules by a reaction that we're about to study in a huge amount of detail. Okay, and then mevalonate molecules can be used to assemble cholesterol. Now, why is this reaction here? Why is this step so important? Why does everyone dwell on this step? Well, it's because this step is the rate-limiting step of the entire process. It controls the rate at which you produce cholesterol. What I mean by that is how fast this reaction occurs determines how much cholesterol you produce. All the other steps will just occur once you've produced the mevalonate. This is the one which limits how much cholesterol you produce. Again, that's why everyone dwells on this step so much in cholesterol biosynthesis. And then very few people ever bother to learn the other steps of cholesterol biosynthesis. Okay, right. So let's study this reaction in more detail. Okay, so this reaction firstly is catalyzed by a very famous enzyme that is in the membrane of the endoplasmic reticulum. Okay, and this very famous enzyme is called HMG-CoA reductase, okay, because it's going to catalyze the reduction of the HMG-CoA molecules. Okay, so this is the enzyme which catalyzes this. Now, what does it actually do? How does it convert HMG-CoA into mevalonate? Okay, well, to do it, you have to bring in some electrons, okay? After all, we are reducing this molecule, so you have to bring in some electrons. Reduction is gain of electrons, okay? So you bring in these electrons in the form of two molecules of the electron carrier, NADP, okay, in its reduced form, so NADPH. Okay, now let me just tell you a little bit about NADP molecules. Okay, so NADP molecules, before they have been reduced, so when NADP is in its oxidized form, it has a positive charge, okay? So this molecule, NADP, is a positively charged molecule normally, okay? However, what you can attach onto this is what's called a hydride anion, okay, an H negative, okay? Now this is an odd sort of ion for a hydrogen atom, okay? We are most used to seeing hydrogen with a positive charge, where hydrogen has lost its only electron and then has a positive charge and is merely a proton. Here we are seeing a hydrogen atom that has actually gained an electron and has become negatively charged, okay? And that's called a hydride ion, or a hydride anion, since it's a negatively charged ion. Okay, and this consists of a proton at the center in the nucleus, then with two electrons orbiting that proton at the center. Okay, so here are the two electrons orbiting the proton, and then the protons at the center there. So that's what a hydride anion basically is. So when you attach a hydride anion onto NADP, it becomes NADPH, okay? It's now neutral, hence why we no longer have the positive charge, because the negative charge on the hydride anion has neutralized the positive charge on the NADP. Okay, so these reduced molecules of NADP, they are both holding hydride anions. They're both holding two electrons and a proton each. Okay, so really here we are putting in 4 electrons and 2 protons when we bring in these two molecules of NADPH and oxidize them back to the normal molecule of NADP+, basically. Okay, now you don't actually want 4 electrons and 2 protons. What you really want is 4 electrons and 4 protons. Okay, so what you're also going to need here is 2 hydrogen cations to come in. Okay, 2 hydrogen atoms that have lost their electrons, basically. Okay, and therefore they are just the protons. Okay, so this is effectively 2 protons coming in. This will bring in the 4 electrons and 2 protons. So this is giving us 4 electrons and 2 protons. So now, if all of this comes in, we'll be getting 4 electrons and 4 protons, i.e. really we're now getting 4 hydrogen atoms, okay, that are uncharged. Okay, and that's what we need in order to carry out this conversion of HMG-CoA into mevalonate. Okay, right, so 2 protons plus 2 molecules of NADPH are going to come in. The 2 molecules of NADPH are going to provide, in total, 4 electrons and 2 protons. These 2 protons will add to these 2 protons to give us 4 protons overall, and therefore, overall, we are putting in 4 hydrogen atoms. Okay, 1 proton and 1 electron is a hydrogen atom. Okay, right, so what are we now going to do? Well, I'm going to show you a mechanism that is not supposed to be the actual electronic mechanism. What I'm going to show you is just to try and make you understand how what's on one side adds up to what's on the other side. It's not supposed to be an electronic flow diagram. So I'm not showing you the actual mechanism of the reaction. Okay, I'm just going to show you how the reaction makes sense, how you can make sense of it in your head. Okay, so what you can imagine doing then is breaking this bond between the carbon atom and the sulfur atom here, breaking the thioester bond. Okay, imagine sending one of the electrons in this single bond here back to the carbon and one back to the sulfur. Okay, so this is a single covalent bond. It will consist of 2 electrons, one each from the carbon and the sulfur. Okay, imagine breaking it by giving the sulfur its electron back and the carbon its electron back. Okay, now both the carbon and the sulfur have a free electron. Bind onto the carbon and the sulfur one of your hydrogen atoms, well, 2 of your hydrogen atoms, one onto the carbon, one onto the sulfur. So we are putting in these 4 hydrogen atoms here. So what I'm going to do is put one of them onto the carbon and one of them onto the sulfur. Putting one onto the sulfur will regenerate us the coenzyme A over here. Okay, so that's that product sorted. Okay. Putting one onto the carbon here will create us an aldehyde. Okay, so if you've got a carbon now with a hydrogen and a carbonyl group there, okay, that's what's called an aldehyde group. So that creates us the intermediate, remember, in the reduction. So carboxylic acid goes to aldehyde, goes to alcohol. Okay, so we've now got an aldehyde, but we've still got 2 more hydrogen atoms to put in. So what you can now imagine doing is breaking one of those 2 bonds between the carbon and the oxygen atom here. Okay, send one electron back to the carbon, one back to the oxygen. Okay, then you've got 2 hydrogen atoms here. Stick one now onto the carbon and one onto the oxygen. That will create us an alcohol group here, and it will also put another hydrogen onto this carbon, and that's created us now the alcohol group that we've got here in mevalonate. Okay, so that is what is happening in this reaction. You are reducing the HMG-CoA molecule into a mevalonate molecule plus a coenzyme A molecule by bringing in these 2 molecules of reduced NADP and these 2 protons from free solution. I should have probably stressed that you know, protons are floating about in free solution, so you can get those. Okay, right. So again, I will stress that this is the reaction that is occurring in, well, which can occur in all cells of the body, well, most cells of the body, okay, if they need cholesterol, okay, and cells do need cholesterol, they need it for their cell membranes and things like that, okay, so the important thing to understand about this is that this reaction, this HMG-CoA to mevalonate step, which is catalyzed by HMG-CoA reductase, completely determines how fast cholesterol biosynthesis occurs. Okay, so by controlling this one reaction, you control how much cholesterol the cell synthesizes. Okay, so back to statins then now. Statins work by inhibiting the HMG-CoA reductase enzyme. All of them work by doing that. Okay, so simvastatin, lovastatin, atorvastatin, they all work by inhibiting HMG-CoA reductase enzymes within cells. Now that stops, or at least is going to hugely reduce the synthesis of cholesterol within peripheral cells and within liver cells in the body. It won't stop all cholesterol biosynthesis simply because when you take a statin drug, it's not going to inhibit absolutely every single HMG-CoA reductase enzyme in the body. You can't hope that the drug would be able to achieve something like that, but it's going to block a good fraction of them. Okay, so it's going to hugely reduce cholesterol biosynthesis around the body, basically. Okay, now, if the cells need cholesterol for something now, okay, where are they going to get the cholesterol from? If they've got problems with their biosynthesis because you've taken the statin drug, they're going to now have to take it from the liver. They're going to now have to take it from the blood. Okay, they're going to have to take it from the LDL pool within the blood. Okay, and therefore they'll take more cholesterol out of the blood. You can reduce blood cholesterol level, and that's how statins work to treat hypercholesterolemia. Okay, right. So that's all lovely, that's a lovely piece of pharmacology, okay, but where's the chronopharmacodynamics here? Where is the fact that if you take these statins in the evening, it has more effect, okay? So why do these drugs have more effect in the evening? Okay, well this is because the levels of HMG-CoA reductase actually show a circadian oscillation. Okay, so cells have HMG-CoA reductase levels oscillating on a 24-hour basis, and this means that their cholesterol biosynthesis shows a 24-hour oscillation, basically. Okay, so here on the x-axis, this is time again, okay, and basically, again, cholesterol biosynthesis is lowest at 8 o'clock in the morning, okay, and it goes up to its highest at around 8 o'clock in the evening. Then it will start to drop throughout the evening, or throughout the night rather, okay, to its minimum at 8 o'clock in the morning. So basically this is cholesterol biosynthesis, and the reason that cholesterol biosynthesis varies like this, the reason it's highest during the evening is because that's when HMG-CoA reductase expression is highest. So basically inside cells, this is HMG-CoA reductase level oscillating on a 24-hour basis. So cells have their circadian rhythms, okay, and one of the things downstream of the circadian clock that is oscillating is then the HMG-CoA reductase level. Okay, so it's lowest at 8 o'clock in the evening, and then it goes up to its highest at, it's lowest in 8 o'clock in the morning, and then it goes up to its highest level at 8 o'clock in the evening. Okay, and in synchrony with this oscillation in HMG-CoA reductase, you're then going to get an oscillation, of course, in cholesterol biosynthesis. So cholesterol biosynthesis will be lowest at 8 o'clock in the morning, and then it will get to its highest in the evening. Okay, and this is why statins are going to have the biggest effect if you take them in the evening, okay, because if you take them in the morning, there's not that much HMG-CoA reductase in your cells anyway, okay, so there's not that much for the drug to actually block once it gets into the cell, okay, so you're not going to actually block that much cholesterol biosynthesis because not much is happening anyway. Whereas if you take them in the evening, that's when most cholesterol biosynthesis is actually occurring in hepatocytes and peripheral cells, and therefore the target for the drug, the HMG-CoA reductase, is most active at that time, so you're going to have the biggest effect on blocking cholesterol biosynthesis if you take the drug during the evening, basically. Okay, so that then is an example of pharmacodynamics, because it's the target for the drug that is varying on a 24-hour basis, rather than the pharmacokinetics, the delivery of the drug to the site, that varies on a 24-hour basis. Okay, right, so that's why you should take statins in the evening to have the biggest effect on cholesterol biosynthesis. Okay, just to end with, let me say that there is a lot of interest into the chronopharmacology of anti-cancer chemotherapies. Okay, so cancer cells will have circadian oscillations, their behaviours oscillate on a 24-hour basis, okay, and there is a lot of evidence starting to accumulate that different anti-cancer drugs will have more effect at killing cancer cells if you take them at different times of the day, okay? So cancer cells' susceptibility to a cytotoxic agent varies depending on the time of day, okay, and there is a lot of interest into whether taking an anti-cancer chemotherapy drug is therefore going to be more effective at a certain time of day than at other times of the day. Okay, right. However, that's still in its infancy, so I can't really say much more about that, whereas these are much more concrete examples. But I hope these illustrate the basic principles of what chronopharmacology is. It's fair to say that chronopharmacology is still in its infancy, and I think in years to come we will see it expand as a field. Okay, so that now concludes my discussion of circadian clocks.